The dampness of the morning clings to the heavy canvas of army trucks as they rumble down the narrow, rutted roads of the French countryside. The smell of wet earth and gasoline fills the air, the sound of engines and shouts of soldiers punctuating the stillness of dawn. The summer of 1944 has not been kind to the Allies, and yet they have pushed forward. Over 4 million soldiers are now on the soil of Nazi-occupied Europe, but what they lack, they feel most acutely, time. The Germans are well entrenched, and the Allies are in a race against it. In the hills above, hidden behind thick trees and the remnants of burned-out villages, the German High Command watches with increasing concern. It is August 25, 1944, and the German forces have been losing ground ever since the D-Day landings 2 months ago. But they're not just losing territory. They're losing the will to fight. The Allies have broken through Normandy, punched into the heart of France, and now, just outside Paris, the pressure is on. But what the Allies don't realize yet is that their biggest challenge is not the enemy's guns or fortifications, but something far simpler: the logistics of war. Across a smoky battlefield, amidst burning tanks and scattered debris, General George S. Patton stands at the edge of a field. His face is shaded by the brim of his helmet, the dust of combat clinging to his uniform. He's been here before, this exact place, this exact situation. His mind races through the calculations, the possibilities. His men are exhausted, his supplies are low, but he knows that what's next is the key. He must move. The Germans know this too. Patton doesn't need fuel, he needs blood, they say back in Berlin. And the truth is, they don't yet know the terrifyingly simple way that Patton plans to win the race. And they're about to underestimate it. The Red Ball Express. It's a name that will soon be whispered in the hallways of the German General Staff. To them, it's nothing but a simple joke. In a war where precision, firepower, and strategy are the name of the game, the Allies' solution to a logistics problem seems almost laughable. Trucks, hundreds, even thousands of trucks to carry supplies from Normandy to the front lines. German generals laugh behind their maps, scoffing at the idea that such a simple solution could possibly fuel the engine of the war. But they don't know the Americans. They don't know what happens when necessity, ingenuity, and sheer will come together. And they certainly don't know that the very same trucks they mock will be the force that keeps the Allies moving faster than the German generals could ever imagine. The Red Ball Express is more than just a supply line. It's the backbone of Patton's blitz. It's his lifeline, and the very thing that will drive the Germans to the brink of collapse. But that's something the Germans won't understand until it's too late. It's a simple solution, one born from desperation. But the path to victory won't be as simple as it seems. At this point, the chapter ends on the realization that the Germans are unaware of how a logistical system, seemingly so mundane, could play a pivotal role in the coming storm. The viewer is left on edge, knowing that the underestimation of this system will soon lead to a chain of events no one could have predicted. The summer of 1944 had become a war of attrition. Across the vast fields of Europe, it was no longer just a matter of tanks clashing or men charging at each other with rifles raised. It had become a contest of logistics, of who could keep their forces supplied, who could move faster, and who could hold on just a little longer before the supply lines snapped. It was, in many ways, the unseen force of the war, the one thing that determined victory, but was never given the same glory as the tanks or the planes. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, sat at his desk in a dimly lit room. A map of France sprawled across the table in front of him, dotted with red and blue pins marking every major city, every point of resistance, every path of the advancing Allies. The lines were moving, but not fast enough. Not nearly fast enough. Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious invasion in history, had been a success. The Allies had stormed the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, and had since made considerable headway into the heart of occupied France. But that was the easy part. The problem now was not the enemy in front of them, but the ones they were leaving behind. The trucks that couldn't get to the front lines fast enough, the ammunition that had yet to be delivered, the food and medical supplies sitting idly in warehouses thousands of miles behind the front. And worst of all, the supply trucks that had to navigate over bombed-out roads, past enemy-held towns, and under the constant threat of German air raids. The logistical nightmare was growing by the day, and the situation was becoming critical. Eisenhower could feel it in his bones. Without a solution, the entire campaign would stall. Patton's armored units would be immobilized, the Allied momentum would grind to a halt, and the Germans would have a chance to regroup. Across the Channel, the British were facing their own challenges. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, a man of meticulous planning, had insisted on a slow and steady advance. The British forces, more cautious in their approach, had taken their time consolidating and pushing inland. But the American approach was different. They were brash, aggressive, unpredictable, and Patton was the epitome of that attitude. Patton's obsession with speed had already become legendary. He had been given command of the Third Army, a force made up of nearly 300,000 men and thousands of tanks and vehicles. His job was to break through the German defenses, drive into the heart of France, and eventually liberate Paris. But that meant one thing above all else. He needed fuel. Fuel meant victory, and fuel was in dangerously short supply. Patton had always believed that the key to success in war was mobility. But without the means to fuel that mobility, his army would be just another pile of rusting metal. In his mind, the only thing more dangerous than a tank in motion was a tank that had run out of gas. He could almost taste the frustration in the air as the miles of road between Normandy and the front line stretched endlessly before him. But Patton was not one to sit idly by and wait. For the perfect conditions, he would find a way to keep moving, whatever it took, and this was where the story of the Red Ball Express began. The idea was born not in the minds of generals or strategists, but from the men on the ground. The logistics officers, the supply clerks, the truck drivers, the ones who truly understood the desperate need for a constant flow of supplies. They had been driving through hell, day and night, under the ever-present threat of enemy fire, with trucks so overloaded they could barely keep moving. But still they moved, and it was that determination that would soon fuel Patton's push into Germany. The Red Ball Express was a simple concept, a convoy system designed to deliver supplies from the Normandy beaches to the front lines as quickly as possible. But there was one major catch. It had to work across enemy-held territory. That meant driving through the same war-torn towns, dodging the same German ambushes, and overcoming the same roadblocks that had halted every other supply effort up until that point. At the heart of the operation was a ragtag group of men who didn't wear uniforms like the soldiers on the front lines. They wore the drab coveralls of truck drivers, the grease-streaked faces of men who knew the machinery of war better than they knew the insides of a barracks. These men were the unsung heroes of the war, a force of ordinary individuals who would soon prove that even in the chaos of battle, logistics could become an unstoppable weapon, but it wasn't going to be easy. The Germans had their own logistical systems in place. Of course, though, they had been stretched thin after years of war. Hitler's Wehrmacht had been fighting on two fronts for nearly 3 years, and by the summer of 1944, they were running out of everything: manpower, supplies, morale. But one thing they still had in abundance was the one thing that could crush any effort to push through their lines: time. They knew that the Allies couldn't maintain a sustained push without adequate supplies. They knew that if they could just hold out long enough, the Allied advance would slow, then stop. And in their minds, the idea of truck convoys running through their territory, delivering supplies directly to the front, was absurd. They dismissed it as another desperate attempt to keep the Allies moving forward, a last-ditch effort from an army on the verge of collapse. Their generals were sure that the supply lines would fail. They were certain the convoy system would collapse under the weight of its own inefficiency. No army could maintain that kind of pace, not even the Americans. But Patton knew something the Germans did not. He knew that war was won by speed, by momentum, and by keeping the enemy off balance. His tanks, his men, they needed to keep moving, and he was determined to make it happen, no matter the cost. But the clock was ticking. Supplies were running low, and in the battle for Europe, every second counted. The Red Ball Express had begun, but it was already facing its first test. Could it deliver the goods, or would it be crushed under the weight of its own ambition? As the chapter ends, the viewer is left with the growing tension. The truck drivers are already on the move, but the Germans remain unaware of how close the Allies are to unleashing their next game-changing move. With Patton's pressure mounting, it becomes clear that this logistical gamble could either fuel the rapid advance of the Allies or spell disaster. In the sterile command rooms of Berlin, where maps were spread across tables like the intricate threads of a vast, untouchable web, the German high command sat in what had become a familiar and bitter routine. Victory had once seemed inevitable, but now the stark reality of war was slowly encroaching upon the very heart of the Nazi regime. The tide was turning. The Allies had launched the invasion on the coast of Normandy, and 2 months had passed since those first brutal landings. The Wehrmacht, battered from the onslaught of both the Soviet East and the relentless Allied drive from the West, had found itself on the back foot, retreating from positions once thought impregnable. At the head of this table sat General Oberst Heinz Guderian, the architect of the German Blitzkrieg strategy, now a man forced to defend that very doctrine in the face of a relentless enemy. Despite his storied reputation and deep experience, Guderian felt the weight of the German defeat settling upon him like the cold, unforgiving weight of a funeral shroud. Every plan he had made, every maneuver he had championed, had led to this, a slow and painful retreat. But what truly gnawed at the edges of Guderian's mind were the reports, the whispers in the hallways, the rumors of something he could not yet fully understand, the logistics of the Americans. There was talk, vague and scattered talk at first, but the whispers grew louder with each passing day, about convoys. Thousands of trucks running day and night, carrying supplies from the beaches of Normandy into the heart of the Allied advance. The Americans had named it the Red Ball Express. It sounded almost comical to Guderian, a military leader whose success had been based on speed and precision, on movement, on hitting fast and hard before an enemy could react. Trucks to him were the antithesis of that strategy. Slow-moving, vulnerable, and susceptible to every ambush the Germans could throw at them. How could such a thing be a threat? The thought was laughable. "Surely they are deluded," Guderian muttered to his staff one evening, the sharp edge of his voice cutting through the otherwise silent room. He shook his head as he stared at the map of France, his eyes scanning the advancing red arrows of the Allies. "We can destroy their supply lines easily enough. This is nothing more than a diversion." General Alfred Jodl, head of the operations staff of the German High Command, looked up from his papers. He was a man who had seen the collapse of so many brilliant plans, but even now, he could not shake the conviction that the Allies would eventually fail to maintain such an absurdly ambitious effort. Logistics, he believed, was a weak link in every army, especially one so overextended as the Americans. "If they do have such a system, they will not be able to keep it going," Jodl replied, his voice laced with doubt, though tinged with hope. "No army can sustain such a pace for long. Not even them, but Guderian wasn't so sure. Something gnawed at him as he pored over the reports. Despite his professional detachment, there was a flicker of concern that flashed through his mind. He had seen war change, seen battles fought not on the battlefield but in the unseen realms of supply and logistics. He had once been the master of that, driving armies forward with speed and precision, outflanking, outsmarting the enemy. Could this American strategy be the missing link that could finally break through the slow, grinding German defenses? Meanwhile, in the trenches, the ordinary German soldiers were starting to feel the pressure. Their minds were occupied not by high-level strategy, but by the harsh, exhausting daily grind of the war. In the endless fields of France, the soldiers of the Wehrmacht had been fighting for so long that the lines between enemy and ally had begun to blur. They had seen their comrades fall, had watched cities burn, and had been trapped in a war that seemed to offer no end. Now the Allies were everywhere, pushing them back, forcing them into the corners of their defenses. The soldiers could feel it, the fear creeping in. One such soldier, Hans, a 22-year-old infantryman from Bavaria, had fought in France since the early days of the invasion. He was not a strategist or a general. He was simply a man who had been sent to hold a line. In the chaos of battle, he had seen his fair share of destruction, the burning tanks, the shattered buildings, the screams of his fellow soldiers. But it was the trucks that had begun to haunt him. He didn't know much about the Red Ball Express. Who could? But he had seen the Americans' movements. He had seen the trucks coming and going, loaded with supplies that they unloaded in constant streams, like an endless river of resources. What bothered him most wasn't the trucks themselves, but the feeling of helplessness they caused. They seemed to appear out of nowhere, almost like ghosts, and with each passing day, they brought more of everything the Allies needed: fuel, ammunition, rations, the very lifeblood of the advancing armies. He had been on a patrol near one of the roads where the Red Ball convoys traveled. The Germans had set up an ambush, hoping to catch the Americans off guard. But as the convoy appeared over the horizon, the Germans quickly realized that they were too late. The trucks were already being escorted by American soldiers, moving in such precise formations that it was impossible to disrupt them. The Germans had set traps, laid mines, and hoped for an easy kill. But the trucks passed by, unscathed, moving with eerie regularity, like clockwork. Hans had stood there, hidden in the bushes, watching as the convoy rolled past, and he felt a strange sense of awe. These were no ordinary trucks. They were a force unto themselves. They didn't stop, didn't falter, and most importantly, they didn't get tired. It was as if the Americans had found a way to keep moving, no matter what. Back in the command rooms of Berlin, Guderian still scoffed at the idea that something as simple as a truck system could outsmart the Wehrmacht's elite forces. But as he pondered over the maps, the reality began to sink in. Could they really sustain this? Could the Allies keep this up? Or was it just a matter of time before the cracks in the system would show? He didn't know. But one thing was certain. They had underestimated the Allies before, and now they were doing it again. The question hung in the air like a weight that none of them could escape. Could the Red Ball Express keep its momentum? Or was it destined to collapse under its own ambition? The chapter concludes with the Germans' disbelief, dismissing the Red Ball Express as nothing more than a fleeting inconvenience, a tactic that could never sustain the Allies' war effort. But as the view shifts to the soldiers on the ground, both the Germans and Americans, the sense of unease builds. The German forces may not yet understand the danger, but the first signs of the growing threat are starting to show. The tension is palpable, and the Americans' relentless drive is about to clash with the very overconfidence that has been the Germans' undoing. The sun hung low over the horizon as August deepened, and the air in northern France was thick with the haze of battle. The days had become a blur of dust, sweat, and the constant roar of engines. The vast network of roads that crisscrossed the Usa French countryside, the arteries of an advancing army, had become the lifeline for General George Patton's Third Army. If Patton was to fulfill his mission of breaking through to the heart of Germany, then these roads, lined with thousands of trucks, would carry him there. The Germans, still confident in their positions, had no idea how quickly things were about to unravel. They had underestimated the Allies' ability to keep their forces supplied. They thought the Red Ball Express was nothing more than a minor inconvenience, a temporary fix. But they hadn't reckoned on the sheer audacity and unrelenting willpower of the American machine. It was August 30th, and the Red Ball Express was in full swing. The trucks, loaded with everything from ammunition to food to medical supplies, moved in convoy after convoy, creating a rhythmic pulse of motion that seemed unstoppable. The drivers, many of them African-American soldiers from the 6888th Central Postal Directory Battalion, had become the unsung heroes of this supply chain. They drove through bombed-out villages, over roads pockmarked with craters, dodging the occasional sniper fire and the ever-present threat of Luftwaffe bombers. Their mission was simple: keep moving and keep Patton's tanks fueled. The roads were a blur of motion, a lifeline to the future of the Allied advance, yet the men who manned the convoys knew that every mile could be their last. They had seen what happened when trucks broke down, when convoys were delayed. The German forces, increasingly desperate, had already begun to target these supply lines, aware that without fuel and ammunition, the Allies could not sustain their momentum. In the lead convoy, Sergeant Jack Robinson, a driver who had been with the Red Ball Express since its inception, had seen more than his fair share of close calls. The rattle of enemy fire echoed through the air as his truck, a massive 2.5-ton Chevy, sped through a narrow stretch of road. The sky above was clear, a cruel contrast to the chaos below. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white with tension. To his right, an anti-aircraft gunner manned his post, eyes scanning the heavens for any sign of the Luftwaffe. The road was long, but the trucks kept moving. They had no choice. As the convoy passed through a small village, the air seemed to shift. The sound of distant artillery rumbled in the background. Robinson's mind raced. He could feel the tension in his bones, the gut-wrenching, instinctive knowledge that something was wrong. The roads had been quiet lately. Too quiet. The Germans had withdrawn from this area, but now something had changed. The convoys had been ambushed before. If the Germans were going to strike, this was the place. Suddenly a sharp crack split the air. Robinson slammed the brakes. The truck lurched to a halt. The convoy behind him skidded, a series of groans and screams echoing as they braked hard to avoid a collision. Robinson's heart raced as he reached for his rifle. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw the glint of metal, a German anti-tank gun hidden in a thick cluster of trees. "Ambush!" he shouted, his voice hoarse with adrenaline. The first explosion hit just ahead, followed by a second, and then another. The ground trembled beneath the trucks as enemy shells tore through the air. Dust billowed in thick clouds, blinding the convoy. Robinson's fingers tightened around the wheel, and he heard the orders shouted over the radio. "All units, take cover. Move to the right. Move to the right." The trucks were vulnerable, each one a massive target on an open road. The men in the convoy had trained for this moment, but that didn't make it any easier. As another shell whistled overhead, one of the trucks behind Robinson exploded in a blinding flash, sending a plume of fire into the sky. The smell of burning rubber and fuel filled the air. Through the smoke and chaos, Robinson's convoy surged forward. There was no time to hesitate, no time to second-guess. He slammed his foot on the gas, pushing the truck forward, barreling through the hellish landscape. Behind him, the rest of the convoy followed suit, their headlights cutting through the smoke like beacons in the dark. On the German side of the battle, the ambush was just one part of the larger picture. General Guderian, still watching the war unfold from his command post, had begun to sense a shift in the tides. He had dismissed the Red Ball Express, but now even he could feel the pressure mounting. His army, already stretched thin, could not afford to keep up with the relentless pace set by the Allies. The trucks, though seemingly insignificant, were becoming an insurmountable obstacle. From his vantage point, Guderian could see the problem clearly. The Allies had reached the point where their supply lines could not be disrupted. The more the Germans fought to halt the convoys, the faster the Allies would advance. There was no longer any question of whether the trucks would sustain Patton's blitz. They had already proven their worth. The Germans, in their confidence, had underestimated the power of sheer momentum. They had assumed that the supply lines would falter, that the Americans would lose their will to keep pushing forward when the roads became too dangerous. But the Red Ball Express had already become a symbol of American resolve, a mechanical behemoth powered by the will of those who drove it and those it sustained. Back on the ground, the battle was raging. The supply convoys, like arteries feeding the body of the American advance, pressed on, their pace relentless and unyielding. But as each truck rolled closer to the front, the Germans realized they were facing something more dangerous than just a convoy of trucks. The Americans were adapting, evolving, and finding ways to meet the challenge head-on. Patton's tanks could now move faster, farther, and with more firepower than ever before, all thanks to the trucks that seemed to appear out of nowhere, bringing supplies with eerie regularity. In the midst of this chaos, Patton's Third Army continued its advance toward Paris. The city was just a few days away, and the race to liberate it was reaching its climax. But as the German forces scrambled to respond, they were confronted with a chilling truth. The Americans were not slowing down. For the first time, Guderian and his men began to question whether they could truly stop the Allied advance. The logistics that had once seemed a laughable afterthought had now become an unstoppable force. But the battle was far from over. The album Germans had one final card to play, and they would soon find out that nothing, not even the Red Ball Express, was immune to the brutal and unforgiving chaos of war. This chapter ends with the crushing realization that the Allies' logistical system, mocked by the Germans just weeks before, has now become a critical factor in the battlefield. But with the ambush on the convoy, the tension escalates. The Red Ball Express is under attack, and Patton's blitzkrieg could come to a halt if the Germans can exploit this vulnerability. Will the trucks survive the onslaught, or will the Allies' supply lines finally break? The days bled into one another as August gave way to September. The battle for France had become a grotesque dance of survival, a clash not only of armies, but of wills. On the battlefield, amid the crumpled tanks and scorched earth, the cost of war could be measured not in the number of men lost, but in the weight each soldier carried, physically, mentally, and emotionally. And for the men of the Red Ball Express, the unrelenting pace of battle had become a grueling test of endurance, where every moment of success was tempered by the fear of losing it all. As General Patton's Third Army continued its relentless drive toward Paris, there was an unmistakable rhythm to the war now, a pulse that could be felt in the very dirt beneath the wheels of the convoys. Day after day, the trucks of the Red Ball Express cut their way through the battered French countryside, their engines a constant hum that seemed to blend with the thunder of distant artillery. It was no longer just about moving supplies. It was about holding on, about keeping the promise of victory alive, even when every inch of ground seemed soaked in blood. For the men driving the trucks, the risks were now far more immediate. The ambushes had escalated. German artillery and air raids had become more frequent, and the once routine journey had transformed into a harrowing gamble. Sergeant Jack Robinson, who had been with the Red Ball Express since its earliest days, had seen men killed by sniper fire while unloading crates of rations, watched entire convoys incinerated by a single well-placed bomb. But he never stopped driving. He couldn't afford to. His mission was simple: get the supplies through, no matter the cost. The cost was mounting. One of the convoy's worst days came on September 3rd, when the Germans launched a series of attacks aimed directly at the supply chain. As Robinson's convoy snaked its way through a small, sleepy town in the French countryside, they were ambushed by a well-coordinated German force that had anticipated their movements. It was one of the largest, most lethal attacks the Red Ball Express had faced up to that point. As the first shell landed near the lead truck, the convoy was thrown into chaos. Explosions rocked the earth, sending debris flying in every direction. Robinson barely had time to react. In a blur of motion, his truck was slammed by the blast of a German mortar. The front grille buckled and the engine sputtered, sending up a plume of black smoke. Robinson jumped from the cab, instinctively reaching for his rifle. The sound of distant gunfire was drowned by the cries of wounded men, the desperate shouts of soldiers trying to drag their comrades to safety. The convoy had come to a screeching halt, the trucks scattered like fallen toys in the debris, but there was no time for fear. Robinson looked to his right, seeing the other trucks under heavy fire, their drivers scrambling to get out and fight back. The soldiers who weren't injured were scrambling to form a perimeter, using the few remains of their trucks for cover. The Germans had struck hard, their gunfire unrelenting. As Robinson ducked behind the wheel of his truck, the world around him was a blur of fire, screams, and the acrid smell of burning fuel. He could feel the weight of it. The lives of every man, every soldier, every trucker depended on the strength of this mission. And in that moment, Robinson realized that the success of the Red Ball Express wasn't just about trucks and supplies. It was about people, the men who refused to stop. The men who kept pushing forward even when there seemed to be no hope left. The battle raged for hours. But it wasn't the guns or the bombs that would decide the outcome. It was the courage of the men who fought in the dirt, their feet soaked in the blood of their comrades, their hearts heavy with the knowledge that there could be no retreat. Robinson fought with everything he had, pushing through the fog of war, determined to complete his mission. And when the convoy finally broke free, the weight of the moment hit him like a hammer. The trucks were barely moving, their tires shredded, their engines burning out. But they had made it through. Barely. Back in the rear, thousands of miles away from the front lines, the cost was being tallied. In the makeshift offices that ran the logistics of the war, officers worked frantically to assess the damage. Some convoys had been decimated. Others were limping back to base, their drivers shaken and exhausted. The toll on the men had been heavy, and yet the demand for supplies never stopped. Patton himself, at his headquarters just outside Paris, had received the news of the ambush. His face, often a mask of confidence and unyielding will, now showed the strain of leadership under fire. He knew the cost of failure, and he knew that every man who had fallen, every convoy that had been lost, was a piece of the puzzle that had to be accounted for. His obsession with speed and mobility had pushed his men to the breaking point, but it had also made them stronger, more resilient. Patton's entire strategy hinged on this one critical point. The Red Ball Express had to keep moving, no matter the casualties. He knew it wasn't just about fuel and ammunition. It was about keeping the enemy on their heels, about denying them the time to regroup and strike back. But the cost, even for him, was becoming too clear. The soldiers of the Red Ball Express, the men whose lives were tied to the hum of their engines and the grit in their bones, were suffering a cost that no one had anticipated. It was more than just the physical toll. It was the emotional weight, the burden of war, that was beginning to wear down even the strongest of them. In a quiet moment, Patton sat at his desk, his eyes scanning the reports, his fingers tapping restlessly on the surface. The weight of the war seemed to crush him in that instant. His army was advancing, yes, but at what cost? Each victory seemed to come at the expense of the men who made it possible. For all his bravado, for all his speeches about speed and glory, the reality of it all was beginning to sink in. He was losing men. He was losing trucks. And worst of all, he was losing the human spirit that had powered the entire campaign. In the heat of battle, the idea of the Red Ball Express as a simple logistical tool seemed so small. It wasn't just about moving supplies anymore. It was about the men who had poured their sweat and blood into keeping the machine running. The battle was still raging, the wheels of war grinding forward with relentless force, but something had shifted. The realization of the human cost of victory was now evident to all. In those quiet moments between attacks, between supply runs, the men of the Red Ball Express and Patton's forces began to understand that this war was not just about the material, the tanks, the guns, the planes. It was about the people who kept it all moving, who fought not for glory, but for survival, for a promise made to their comrades and their country. But the question remained, how much longer could they keep going? How much longer could the trucks, the men, the army itself keep pushing forward before they too would break under the weight of it all? This chapter ends on a haunting realization. The men of the Red Ball Express and Patton's forces are paying an enormous price for victory. The physical and emotional toll is becoming evident, and the relentless push toward Paris, while seeming like an unstoppable force, carries with it the heartbreaking cost of human life. As the battle rages on, the emotional weight of the war becomes undeniable. The air was still thick with smoke, the haze of battle hanging over the fields of France as September drew to a close. The roads, once humming with the ceaseless motion of trucks, now lay eerily quiet. The broken bodies of men and machines scattered the land like the remnants of a storm. The once pristine landscapes of Normandy and the surrounding villages had become graveyards, silent witnesses to the horror that had unfolded in their midst. Yet amid the destruction, the sound of engines still rumbled, a soft, persistent echo of the resolve that had carried the Allies across Europe. The Red Ball Express, though battered and torn, had not faltered. It had delivered day after day through the smoke and fire, the broken landscapes and the empty villages. It had kept Patton's tanks fueled, his men fed, and the Allied advance into Paris moving. It had become something far greater than a simple logistics operation. It had become a symbol of determination, of resilience, and of the unyielding spirit of those who made it happen. As the city of Paris lay just a few miles ahead, Patton's forces, bloodied but victorious, began to realize that the war, at least in this part of Europe, was coming to an end. The Germans, though still holding their ground in some pockets, were in full retreat. The streets of Paris were no longer under siege. The crowds, their faces drawn and weary from the months of occupation, began to emerge from their homes, greeted by the advancing Allies. But for Patton, the victory was bittersweet. The liberation of Paris was not just a military triumph, it was the culmination of everything he had fought for. But in the shadows of that victory was the realization that the human cost of this war was too great, too overwhelming to be celebrated without reflection. The men of the Red Ball Express, their faces smeared with dirt and exhaustion, walked through the streets of Paris like ghosts. They had given everything to keep the wheels of the war turning. They had sacrificed their bodies, their time, their sanity to ensure that the tanks kept rolling, that the bombs kept falling, that the Allied forces kept their momentum. And now, as the war seemed to reach its climax, they could only wonder what would be left of them when the dust finally settled. Robinson, the truck driver who had spent countless days weaving through the chaos of war, stood silently on the outskirts of Paris. He gazed out over the city, his eyes weary, his mind struggling to make sense of it all. Paris was free, but at what cost? He thought of the men he had lost along the way, the drivers who had never made it back, the soldiers whose blood had soaked into the roads he had driven. He thought of the countless hours spent on the highways, pushing his truck through the night, barely pausing to sleep, always hearing the sounds of distant artillery, of bombers overhead, of the screams of his comrades. He had done it because it had to be done, because someone had to do it. But in that moment, standing in the shadow of Paris, Robinson couldn't shake the feeling that it hadn't been worth it. Not completely. The faces of the dead flashed in his mind like fleeting shadows. The men who had driven beside him, who had laughed with him in the moments between ambushes, who had died in the flames of battle, never to see the victory they had fought for. For Patton, the liberation of Paris was a glorious moment, a testament to his leadership, to the speed and precision that had driven the Third Army forward. But as he stood in front of his men, watching the victory unfold, he too couldn't escape the haunting reality of what had been lost. Every speech he gave, every line of bravado seemed hollow now. The cost had been too high. There was no glory in the death of young men. There was no honor in watching the faces of those who had given everything, only to be left with the wreckage of a war they could never forget. But that was the nature of war. The enemy didn't care. The world didn't care. The war had moved on, and in its wake it left only the shattered pieces of those who had survived. And yet for all the pain and loss, for all the destruction, there was something undeniable about this moment. The moment when the Allies stood victorious, when the American flag was hoisted over Paris. It was a moment of triumph. Yes, but also a moment of reckoning. The Red Ball Express had done its job. It had kept the supply lines open, had kept Patton's tanks rolling forward, had helped to secure the victory in France. But in the quiet moments, when the war seemed distant and the world began to rebuild, it was clear that the true victory was not measured in tanks, bombs, or cities. It was measured in the human cost of it all, in the men who had fought and died, and in the lives that had been irrevocably changed. The survivors of the Red Ball Express would return home, but they would carry the scars of war with them. The faces of those lost, the endless days spent on the road, the destruction they had witnessed. It would stay with them forever. And in the quiet corners of the world, those who had driven the trucks, those who had fueled Patton's blitz, would be forgotten, lost to history. But not by those who had known them. Not by those who had witnessed the incredible sacrifice, the tireless work, and the unfathomable courage that had made the Red Ball Express the lifeblood of the Allied advance. The men who had driven those trucks would be remembered by those who understood the true cost of victory. And so, as the Allied forces pushed deeper into Europe, the war would continue with all its madness, its cruelty, and its heartbreaking cost. But in Paris, the sun was finally shining again. The long, hard road of war had been hard fought, and it had been won, not by tanks, not by generals, but by the men who had refused to stop. by the men who had carried the weight of war on their backs and refused to let it crush them. The Red Ball Express had delivered victory, but in the end, it was not just victory that was delivered. It was the undeniable truth that war, for all its promises, would never be free of sacrifice, never free of loss. The question, as the war rumbled on, remained, was it worth it? And in the hearts of those who had fought and survived, that answer would echo for the rest of their lives. This final chapter closes with an emotional reflection on the human cost of the war, and the profound impact it had on the men who fought it. The Red Ball Express, a lifeline to Patton's victory, is not merely a logistical achievement. It is a symbol of the uncelebrated sacrifices made by the soldiers who kept the wheels of war turning. The victory in Paris may be celebrated, but it is forever tempered by the recognition that true victory comes at an unbearable cost, one that no amount of glory or triumph can ever fully redeem.